Morning, everybody, and thank you for joining me. My name is Jackie Messer-LePage, and I'll be your facilitator for this very short overview of emotional intelligence. This program is actually part of a larger program in the Advanced Leadership Development certificate, but it's also incorporated into a number of the administration and leadership programs at the University of Regina. So I'll start by saying that emotional intelligence or emotional quotient intelligence is a term that's often used to describe people around you who really exemplify leadership and strength of character. The value of EQ is really well researched, and you've probably read lots about it. It's often described as one of the most significant predictors of success in the workplace. But what is it, and what does it really mean to you personally? EQI is typically assessed by certified coaches using a combination of survey tools and personal coaching. At the University of Regina, we've adopted the EQI 2.0 assessment, and that in large part has been adopted because it's a psychometrically sound tool. It looks at 5 composite areas relating to emotional intelligence, and we'll talk about each of those. And then each of these composite areas is further broken down into 15 specific competencies. So if you're a person who likes to be able to measure areas of competency so that you can work on it and watch it grow, this might be something that would interest you. In this webinar, we're going to explore the importance of balancing the competencies to enhance EQI, because when you're out of balance, you may think you're being emotionally intelligent, but actually it can be exactly the opposite. So foundationally, there are 3 leading models of emotional intelligence. And the one we're going to talk about today is based on Reuven Bar-On, who coined the phrase EQ back in 1985. You've probably heard of Goleman's model. There's Myers-Briggs. There's a bunch of different personality indicators, but this really is the model that is most commonly used. And he describes 5 specific foundational elements: self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal qualities and abilities, how you make decisions, and how you manage stress. The first area we're going to talk about is self-perception. So self-perception can be broken down into 3 categories. First, there's the self-awareness piece, which, as you probably are aware, emotional intelligence really starts with yourself. Then there's self-regard, so knowing what you excel at and what you bring to the table. And self-actualization is really forward-thinking, feeling like you're meeting your purpose in life. And so we're going to explore each of these just very briefly. Intelligence quotient, I thought I'd throw this slide in because sometimes people get a bit confused about what's what. And intelligence quotient is something that when I was a child, we got measured for IQ in school. In reality, IQ can be measured by standardized tests, but it's highly controversial because we now know that depending on your upbringing and your situation, you may or may not score well. That doesn't necessarily mean you aren't going to do well in life. So IQ actually sets and peaks at about 17 years of age, and until it's starting to become older, and then it starts to decline fairly quickly. The average predictor of job success when you're using IQ, it's about 6%, so it's not really great. It's really a measure of your reasoning ability, and it's supposed to gauge how well you use information and logic to predict outcomes. EQ is also measured by a standardized test, as I mentioned. And it talks about how well you build relationships, how you feel about yourself, and how you make decisions and manage stress. It has 27 to 45% predictor of job success. So we know from the research that EQ actually predicts more success in a particular role, and it's not fixed. So here's the good news for people like myself who are aging. It does taper a bit in old age, but it continues to grow throughout life. So there's all kinds of capacity to grow your EQ and EQI. In terms of emotional intelligence, EQ and EQI are often used interchangeably. EQ is a number. EI is the capacity to use those skills. So how would you describe EI? Emotional intelligence really views self-awareness or emotional awareness and understanding as key competencies that people would strive to develop in order to be effective when interacting with other people. And as a young parent, I remember that was kind of when I began my EQI, EI journey, and I would practice on my kids because I didn't want to be a parent that only resorted to yelling or scolding. So EI manages feelings. It focuses on managing your feelings to support an effective expression of what you need. It involves a lot of impulse control and self-regulation, and it isn't necessarily about being nice. It's about being clear and effective. The beauty of EI is that you can continue to grow it over your lifetime because of the brain's neuroplasticity. And there's tons of research about how you can reprogram your brain to do things differently. So I mentioned it does predict success in life. It supports that if all things are equal, EI is a better predictor of life and work, of success in life and work. So if you think about folks that you've recruited that maybe weren't necessarily super skilled at something in your workplace, but they had a really great capacity to build relationships, those people tend to move forward. They move forward fairly readily or fairly successfully. That's to a large degree what many of us relied on is our relationship building capacity to advance within an organization. The first key competency when you're looking at self-perception is emotional self-awareness. So knowing what that means to you. So if you can't identify how you feel about a certain thing, it's impossible to communicate it properly or effectively. So Brené Brown has written a book called The Atlas of the Heart, and it is a really, really good book that describes the importance of identifying emotions with the correct word, because your brain is pre-programmed to respond based on your own experiences, to respond in a certain way to a certain type of emotion or however we describe it. So if I describe a feeling of anger, when really my feeling is frustration, anger is going to generate a different kind of brain response. So the first thing I'll say to you is start thinking about the emotions that you feel and naming them properly, because only when you name it can you have the ability to change how you respond to it. I just mentioned we have a bit of a lizard brain. We have a fight or flight built in. So when you're starting to feel that anxiousness or that impulse to do something, stop for a minute, think about the emotion and the physical response you're feeling and label it properly. The other piece that is important in emotional intelligence is the listening component. And we know that human beings speak at about 275 words a minute, but we process at about 500 words a minute. So when somebody is saying something and they've triggered a response in us, oftentimes we're thinking of how to respond instead of thinking about what did they mean, how did they intend to hurt our feelings, what were they going for? So sometimes I catch myself when somebody says something and I feel a surge or a response, I catch myself thinking about how to respond or how to say something back instead of trying to understand. So it's an awareness piece, right? Just like anything else, the more you become aware of these factors, the more you have the ability to control the way you respond to them. The other piece that's really important in emotional intelligence is personal triggers. We all have them. We don't often think about them. And so one of the things I work on in my class is spending some time identifying what triggers you. So it could be something as simple as somebody raising their voice, or as somebody who turns their back to you, or somebody who picks up their cell phone in the middle of your lunch and you're visiting with them. And those personal triggers elicit a response, and you want to think about why you're triggered, what the response is and what you think how you'd rather be responding. So in your experience, you should start by thinking of what kinds of conversations are the most difficult and how they trigger a response in you. So it could be something around values or breach of boundaries or even masks, and what kind of trigger you feel. The second key competency under self-perception is self-regard. And that is having respect for yourself, but understanding that you also have weaknesses. So self-regard isn't necessarily about being able to talk about all the good things you do in life. It's not self-esteem, pumping yourself up. It really involves understanding the good and the bad and accepting both. Self-esteem is more like self-confidence. It's ignoring perhaps the bad stuff and just focusing only on the good stuff. And people with high self-esteem can sometimes, if they don't have a counterbalance of self-regard, they can look like they're grandiose. So knowing both your strengths and weaknesses is really important. And how do you figure that out? Well, you figure that out by asking for feedback. And some of you may have completed what an assessment tool for feedback called the Johari window. And that is a very commonly used tool to assess how well you might give or receive feedback. I might think that I'm really great at giving feedback. My staff might think something different. So usually what I'd suggest to people is that you do your Johari window yourself and then have your staff assess you, because you might get a totally different picture. So you should think about how often do you ask for feedback? And if people give you feedback, are you willing to accept it? It's not good enough to just say, well, yeah, I ask for feedback all the time, but I dismiss it because I don't like the person. And there are many reasons why we dismiss feedback, but not liking them is one of the big ones. And then if you decide you want to improve certain areas, then you need a deliberate plan. And not unlike how in our workplaces, we make plans for work plans to tie into our strat plan. It's the same thing for personal growth. If you decide that there's a particular area within your basket of skills and qualities that you're not particularly happy with, you need a plan to change things. And I know that sounds very contrived and very, just very rigid, but that is the reality of how you train your brain to think differently about circumstances. And then you make a move. So, and these, I popped the slide up here because these are some of the things that you do need to think about when you're making changes. As human beings, we compare ourselves to other people all the time. And, you need to remind yourself that you're on a journey that's separate and apart from everybody else. Recognizing the physiological states that associate with certain types of feelings, and are you feeling confident? Validating self-perception. So this is one that I know that as adults, sometimes we struggle with. When somebody says something that is offensive, we tend to create a story in our minds about what that means and what the intention was, instead of saying to the person, that came across like you were trying to hurt my feelings. Is that what you're going for? And sometimes just asking people things like that can build their self-awareness as well. And I know it feels awkward, but actually it's a really effective way of dealing with people that tend to push your buttons on purpose. And then the third element of self-perception is the concept of self-actualization. And this is really your ability to reach your capabilities and your capacities. So strong self-actualization really means that you're pursuing things in life that are very meaningful, and you feel like you have a rich and full life. And this is an ongoing and dynamic process. It's not, we're at a point in time today, and if things aren't amazing today, it doesn't mean that that's where you're going to be forever, obviously. So, but when you feel self-actualized, it really is being excited about your interests and feeling like you're really satisfied with the direction you're going in. Goal setting is a big part of building your emotional intelligence capacity and your self-actualization. And goal setting for some people can be an impossible task, depending on where you are in your lives. You may recall from Psych 100, there's a theory of hierarchy that written by Maslow that describes human beings needing a basic need for health and safety before they can start moving up and thinking about love and belonging and relationships and self-actualization. Well, that is the case. If you're certainly in a position right now where you're struggling to find a place to live or feed your family, maybe the goal setting has to be around those things. It's not reasonable if you have a staff member who's struggling at work to expect them to be self-actualized if they can't pay their basic bills. So everything has to be in context. And when you're an emotionally intelligent leader, you're going to ask questions about those other things to make sure your picture of what's going on with an employee is accurate and that you're not just making assumptions. Area 2 is self-expression, and it involves these three areas. So emotional self-expression, independence, and assertiveness. So emotional expression involves openly expressing feelings, and that can be verbal and nonverbal. We have all been through almost 3 years of some of us isolation, working from home. I'm still working from home. And so sometimes the nonverbal is really lost, or half of it. We only get the top half of the nonverbal. So it makes it more challenging. You have to ask more questions. But we all know that when you see something, you should ask questions about it. If somebody is saying something and their body is saying something else, ask a question about it. So, you just said you agreed with me, but I saw you nodding your head like this. So tell me what's going on. And it doesn't have to be threatening. You just need to be inquisitive and curious. So that combined with tone of voice, of course, can tell you a lot about what people are actually feeling. The question to ask yourself is, how do you feel when other people express emotion? What do you do? And in a few minutes, we're going to talk about a concept called mirroring, which is something that, that as human beings, we tend to do. So if somebody's being emotional, do you stop listening? And I talked a little bit about how hard it is to listen when people are talking. Think about it the next time you're struggling to pay attention. How do you demonstrate listening? And some of it is physical. Some of it is, leaning in to try and understand, or rephrasing what somebody has said to you so that they understand that you're paying attention. How do you feel when somebody stops listening to you? Do you stop? Do you ask them, did you go somewhere? What just happened there? It's not offensive to ask people if they're listening to you. If they're not listening to you, that might not be the right time to have the conversation. And again, this is all part of raising your own emotional intelligence. Instead of judging that the person is disinterested, you're going to ask about it. Are you okay expressing emotion? So I ask this question because if you're not, how will anybody around you be okay with it? And so practicing being emotional but not out of control, that's okay. People express emotions because they have a feeling of importance around whatever the issue is. If people did not express emotion and things are happening, you can ask them why. Some people judge individuals who are emotionless, and they assume that they're just disinterested when maybe they're processing. So it's all about reflecting and asking questions and asking people what they think about certain situations. The second piece is under self-expression is independence. So what does independence have to do with emotional intelligence? Well, you can think about leaders that make decisions, and you can see that sometimes those decisions are made independently, sometimes it's done well, sometimes it's not. Independence is linked to assertiveness, and leaders who are strong understand the implications before acting independently. So basically, it's good to be able to make an independent decision when you need to, but good leaders are often very collaborative. So they try not to make decisions in isolation of what's going on with everybody else. All of this is easier said than done. Sometimes it is hard to entertain thoughts without accepting them. independence really is about being self-directed and self-controlled in your thinking and your actions, not being dependent on somebody else emotionally or self-reliant in planning and your decision-making. So when I make a decision, I'm always trying to seek opinions or perspectives before making a decision. But then there are times when you just have to make the decision because it's urgent or because you're the final stop. And as an independent person, effective independent people can function autonomously. They don't need other people to satisfy their emotional needs. So we're going to talk in a few minutes about empathy. And sometimes when we're busy being empathetic, we lose our ability to be autonomous and independent because we're so worried about what other people feel and think. The next area to talk about is self-expression, and assertiveness. So what is assertiveness? Well, it's often misunderstood because assertiveness really involves the ability to communicate clearly and unambiguously, while at the same time, you want to be sensitive to the needs of others. So assertiveness isn't a bully. Assertiveness is respectful of other people's perspectives. It may speak to those perspectives. So as an example, I might say to somebody, you know, I wish I could tell you what you want to hear, but I can't. You know, I'm respectful of what you're asking me to do, but I'm not able to do it. And that's an assertive statement. It's not saying, well, you know what, honestly, I'm just not going to do it. But it is driving the point across that whatever it is, I'm not going to be doing it. Assertiveness involves demonstrating the ability to express feelings and thoughts openly, and ability to take a stand even when it's tough to do so. So it doesn't involve any aggression or aggressive or abusive behavior. Assertiveness is not bullying. The other piece to recognize is your personality leaning. So it's all very, very complicated, and there are many personality scales out there, and you know, many of you have probably done them. The reason we tell people that you should understand your personality leanings is because other folks will have different approaches in terms of their personality, and if you can respect and understand their personality, you can dovetail into it instead of butting right up against it. Area 3 is the interpersonal area, and really it's made up of interpersonal relationships, empathy, and social responsibility. Now, in terms of interpersonal relationships, that's really straightforward. It's give and take. It's interpersonal relationships that are rewarding and enjoyable. But if it's that simple, why do people struggle? And there's a lot to unpack. So really, we're just going to talk about a few high-level elements. See. If you're a person who's able to establish and maintain satisfying relationships with give and take, then you're going to be a person that's probably stronger in terms of your interpersonal relationships. And people know, you know, the people in your world that are very strong at building relationships because they often care a lot about maintaining those relationships too. The next piece is the social environment. So workplace or social, it makes a difference. So how you approach people is really important. Listening to understand, of course, asking questions, being genuine, very important. And choosing your battles. So conflict resolution. When I teach this class, we often touch on conflict resolution and difficult conversations, because a big part of building your emotional intelligence is being able to navigate these types of environments successfully. The next piece I want to talk about is empathy. People define empathy in many ways, but empathy in general is the social and emotional skill it takes to help you feel understood, help you feel and understand things. So it might be having the ability to understand how somebody might feel or perceive a situation, intentions, thoughts, and the needs of others. So all of those types of things. People who are very empathetic are viewed often as being sensitive or perceptive. But sometimes, and we all possess empathy, we possess it in varying degrees though. And some people struggle to empathize while others are exceptionally sensitive to emotions. And the challenge is when empathy is not balanced with decision making or reality testing, what you can end up with is a supervisor who's unable to make a difficult decision because it impacts their staff. And so when you're studying emotional intelligence and trying to build your own capacity, you need to place empathy in an area where, yes, you're appreciative of impact. So the approach you use to make difficult decisions might differ slightly, but you still are able to make the decision. So empathy is a very important part of any leadership model. I won't spend a lot of time on this. I will just tell you there are many layers of empathy, and we, in the course, we tend to dive into the layers quite significantly because it helps people understand why they're approaching things in a certain way. The next piece I want to talk about is called emotional contagion. And this is where I alluded to this earlier. Your brain has what are called mirror neurons in the brain. So when your brain sees something or something activates in your brain automatically wants to mirror it. And the hypothesis is that these same mirror neurons activate when you're exposed to an emotion as well. So if you think about a child and there's one baby crying, all of a sudden you hear 5 babies crying. And this is the brain activating its mirror neurons. It's really important to be able to accurately pick up on the emotions of another person. But in order to do so, you have to understand culture, family, and social contexts, because each of these have different rules on how emotions are displayed and accepted. So in some cultures, emotion is not acceptable or less acceptable. And we may see this as disinterested because we're not people who emote that way. But in a particular culture, it might be completely natural and normal. So for this reason, it's really important to accurately pick up on the emotions of other people and ask questions. Is mirroring behavior and understanding context equal to empathy? Well, researchers argue that it's only with action that you can really demonstrate empathy. So empathy involves understanding and taking action. Empathetic accuracy, well, that's your ability to accurately identify emotions both within and intention within yourself and others. And that is an interior skill. It's interactional because you ask questions, and it's observational. So the quality of your empathetic accuracy is dependent on your own abilities and your own capacity. And this is something that you can build. The next category is social responsibility. Well, what does social responsibility have to do with EQI? Socially responsible people have social conscience and a basic concern for others. So most often these folks have interpersonal sensitivity, and they can accept the gifts that other people bring to the table for the good of the whole. So EQ does include social responsibility because it's important to have concern for the welfare of others and to be able to integrate yourself into the community at large in terms of bettering the whole community as opposed to individuals. So social responsibility is a big part of EQI. Okay, I talked about this. So as you've probably experienced yourself, helping others really helps build self-regard. Focusing on more serious problems than your own tends to put yours into perspective. And having a balance in life creates the flexibility that helps us endure challenges. So then minor setbacks at work aren't a total derailment. And really, are you modeling the behaviors that you want others to emulate? So the questions that I tell folks to ask themselves is, are you involved? Do you want to be, or do you need to be, and what do you need to do? And the fourth area we're going to talk about is decision making. This is really where the rubber hits the road in many organizations. So reality testing, problem solving, and impulse control. Reality testing is the ability to see perception versus what is fact, and seeing things objectively rather than what we wish they would be or fear they are. Sometimes I catch myself not using enough reality in some of my interpretations of what I see. Realistically, if I'm expecting somebody to behave in a certain way and they've never done it for the last 50 years, that's not strong reality testing. So and reality testing emphasizes being pragmatic and objective and verifying and validating your perceptions. Objectivity is important, yes, obviously. Evidence isn't always available. And we may not read the situation correctly, but it is important to understand perspectives and try and be as objective as possible. Validating assumptions, I talked about that a few times now. As adults, sometimes we're very uncomfortable asking people what their intentions are, but that is really a strong way of making sure you're not misunderstanding somebody's intentions. And then the second category is problem solving. So in any given day, you probably solve dozens of problems, if not more. In the EQ environment, we examine what problem solving is. And we start by, looking at what are the facts in this situation, what are the alternatives, evaluating alternatives, et cetera, et cetera. Emotions can really impact your ability to resolve issues if you don't put emotions in context and move towards understanding instead of just emoting. In terms of impulse control, really that's ability to resist or delay an urge to do something or act. Now, the challenge with impulse control is sometimes we can get so agitated around whatever emotion we're feeling that we're distracted and we're not listening anymore. So, strong impulse control involves making rash decisions or despite a difficult circumstance. So it's being able to take that deep breath, to pause, to think, and not act immediately. Poor impulse control, people who throw themselves in front of moving vehicles to stop something, or people who yell and scream in public because they're upset because somebody did something. We're all very good at picking up on other things that other people do and not so good at picking up on the things we do ourselves. And then there's problem solving, and problems in impulse control can look like low frustration or impulsiveness, anger, loss of self-control. And nobody wants to have to apologize for behavior the next day. So effective impulse control is something that we explore within the EQ program, and how to build effective impulse control. So self-control is a really interesting skill, and it can be learned. And there is an experiment that I'll encourage you to go and look up. It was done many, many years ago by, I believe it was a psychologist called Mischel, M-I-S-C-H-E-L. It was an experiment with kids and marshmallows. You can actually just Google the marshmallow experiment. And it was all about kids and impulse control. It's quite interesting. I won't get into it here, but it is something that's kind of really demonstrative of the differences between people and how impulse control feeds into success later in life. And then the last area we're going to talk about is stress management. So this is really interesting. This is the area that people often talk about and they seldom unpack it. And it's a bit bizarre, but something that you can ponder is we often congratulate each other for managing stress well instead of learning to eliminate it. Or we dismiss it as it is the norm and we have to move on. So in my other world, I work for a health regulatory body, and we have health practitioners who are stressed out, and for very legitimate reasons. Instead of examining teaching how to manage stress or how to reframe stress, we look at ways to stick band-aids on stress. This is just how the work is. This is the way, if you want to work in this field, this is the way it's going to be. It doesn't have to be that way necessarily. There are going to be high stress times at work, but seldom is any employment situation intended to be high stress all the time, 24/7. Human beings are not programmed that way to be able to tolerate that for very long. So under the stress management category, we have 3 subcategories: flexibility, stress tolerance, and optimism. So the first one is flexibility. And there are a number of different approaches to building your ability to cope and become flexible. There's cognitive flexibility and behavioral flexibility. And cognitive flexibility really is about teaching your brain to manage stress differently. And if some of you have taken some of the sciences, you'll remember that the cause of all the trouble is the amygdala in the brain. When you're under stress, the amygdala determines a threat exists and starts sounding an alarm and releasing hormones and neurotransmitters. And then it starts a cascade of things physiologically in your body. So because the brain is so neuroplastic, you can actually regenerate in areas that are damaged. You can reprogram it to think differently. So there is some cognitive flexibility work you can do to actually train your brain to manage stress differently. The other important area is the behavioral flexibility and learning how to shift your behaviors from impulsivity to well-disciplined, thought-out approaches to managing stressful situations that you know will emerge. So we talk a fair amount about this as well in the program. Behavioral coping, some of it's really basic. Are you sleeping well? Are you taking breaks throughout the day? Are you moving around? And for those of you who are working from home, if you're anything like me, you tend to plant yourself in front of your desk and then you don't move except to go to the bathroom or to get some coffee. And I find that when I'm working at home, I'm not moving at all. When I'm working in the office, I'm moving around a lot because I'm going to talk to colleagues. So behavioral coping is a big, important part of stress management. And then there's good old distortions. I love talking about distortions because we all have them. They're habitual ways of thinking that we've built over time. So for an example, you make a mistake and your instant thought is, oh, I should have known better. I'm stupid. Or you may think, I think I can do better. I wonder how I can improve. 2 very different styles lead to 2 very different emotions. So is it just mind over matter? Well, learning to replace thoughts that promote distressing emotions with calmer, more upbeat thoughts can really help in terms of stress management. And so this is really the basis for cognitive behavioral therapy, which is used to treat anxiety or PTSD, many of the stress-related conditions. In terms of distortions, these are really the beliefs that we've had, and usually the automatic thoughts that emerge afterwards are unreasonably negative. Distortions cause a lot of stress in our world. These are the typical distortions, okay? So we focus on flaws. We might say, oh, you know what? I'm always looking this way. I'm just so plain. Or, oh yeah, I did that well, but usually I suck at it. Or labeling stuff as, oh, I always screw up, or I'm such a loser, or all or nothing, thinking. So it's always extremes. You're evaluating yourself and others in extremes instead of realistically. So distortions are an important area of managing and mitigating stress. And it's something that we spend a fair amount of time on. As I mentioned, flexibility can really be learned and improve your leadership skills and your emotional intelligence. We rely on old behaviors because they're comfortable. Even when they're dysfunctional, they're comfortable. I always tell folks we need to learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's really unfortunate, but human beings being what we are, we want to feel good. And so when somebody says something to us that makes us uncomfortable, we might use the fight or flight, leave the room, we might fight back. But you kind of have to allow yourself to sit in the discomfort for a period of time so that you can understand it. And so that your response isn't just based on what the amygdala tells you to do. Stress tolerance is another piece. attitude has a lot to do with it. I know that, it's not simple to just take that approach and just say, well, I'm just going to be positive today, because there are many influencing factors, and that's an oversimplification. But, in terms of attitude, I often think about, is the adversity I'm seeing real? What's the actual evidence? Am I ignoring alternatives because I'm just so wallowing so much in that pervasive thought that this is a bad situation? So attitude is a big part of moving through stress. Rumination, well, we've all probably done that from time to time. Rumination is extremely common. Worry is very left brain focused, and it drives you into the details. So sometimes people say you're going down a rabbit hole, and that's what that side of the brain is telling you to do versus the bigger picture. So, worry magnifies the stressor, and it can make you feel like the worst is always happening. So we talk about how to approach worry and rumination and how to move beyond that and get yourself to a better place. And then the last piece is about optimism. So why should we care about optimism? Well, because optimism can lead to less depression, better physical health, and higher achievement. Optimists they tend to be survivors. You can think of the climber a few years ago who had to cut off his arm to save his life. Unfortunately, when we're in high stress situations, we tend to become more rigid, which only decreases your chance of survival. So optimistic people tend to handle stress better. And to build optimism, well, we talk a lot about how to build optimism, but in general, optimists tend to guard against feelings and behaviors that don't support their perspective of optimism. So in their heads, they break down those destructive signals. So they get a signal from somebody's behavior, they ask about it instead of making an assumption. They look at the distortions and they evaluate and unpack the distortion before acting on it. So all of these kinds of things build optimism. Optimists like to be solution focused. And then there's the whole piece on happiness. Well, we all know, everybody says happiness really is dependent on you. And Covey said it, he said, happiness really does hinge on yourself alone. Lasting happiness comes from controlling our own lives and putting our short-term desires to higher purposes and principles. And so, happy people, proven research, happy people live longer. Unexpected happiness can come through the value of just flow and interaction with other people, intense feelings of engagement. So happiness is up to you. And really happiness is a huge part of emotional intelligence, because typically if you're in a space where you're feeling strong as a leader and you're highly emotionally intelligent, you're feeding into what things make you happy. So I think that's a good spot to stop. I have about 15 minutes. If anybody has any questions, happy to answer them.